Welcome back to the GCN Racing News Show. Coming up today, 5 things we learned from the 2021 road season and what they might mean for next year. We've also got the continuation of the Cyclocross World Cup and a look ahead to the brand new UCI Track Champions League. As the dust settled on another fantastic season of road racing, we thought we'd take a look at what we've learnt over the last 10 months. And I think the most obvious one is that Tadej Pogačar is the most complete rider in generations. Now, the year after your first Tour de France win can be tough, I would imagine. Anything but another win is seen as a failure, but it is rare to back up a first win with a second one straight after. In fact, the last person to do that was Lance Armstrong 21 years ago, and if you don't count that because it's been scrubbed from the history books, it was Miguel Indurain back in 1992. But if there was an enormous amount of pressure on the shoulders of Pogačar, it didn't really show. He won his first 2 stage races of this season, the UAE Tour and Tirreno Adriatico. He won his first monument, Liège-Bastogne-Liège in April. He dominated the Tour de France with the largest winning margin in years, and then ended the season with a second monument win at Il Lombardia. So he ended the year with 13 wins from 61 days of racing. An incredible strike rate for anyone, even a bunch sprinter. That win tally this year was equalled by both Wout van Aert and Primož Roglic, but despite their successes, the quality of their wins was not as great as Pogačar's. It also underlined this year that Ineos can't win if Pogačar or Roglic are in the race. So the team was very successful in 2021 with a total of 34 wins. They took overall victories at Catalunya, Romandie, Dauphiné, the Tour de Suisse and the Giro d'Italia. But the one thing all those races had in common is that neither Pogačar nor Roglic were present. Now, it's something I highlighted on this show at the start of the year, but which still amazes me now. The last time Ineos Grenadiers won the overall classification at a stage race in which Primož Roglic started was the 2018 Tour de France, and they've never won the overall classification of a stage race in which Pogačar was riding. And it makes you wonder how they're going to approach the next few years. Now, they are a team that dominated the Tour de France for almost a decade, with 7 wins between 2012 and 2019. But can Geraint Thomas, Richard Carapaz or Egan Bernal, on their best form, beat Roglic or Pogačar? I'm not sure they could, and that must be a bit of a worry for them. Now, the structure of the team roster doesn't look to be changing significantly next year, but there are a number of key changes in the staff. Tim Kerrison, the man who masterminded the training programs for most, if not all of those Tour de France wins, is moving on after over 10 years with the team. Now, we don't know who's replacing him, but we do know that Roger Hammond is coming in as lead sports director from Bahrain Victorious. There are also rumours that Dave Brailsford may be moving on to a new project with Ineos, which would leave Rod Ellingworth at the helm, so there's potentially a significant transition period for the team, and it's going to be very interesting to see how they approach the 2022 Tour de France. We also learnt this year that Mark Cavendish is not done yet. I said publicly that I didn't think he'd ever win a race again after what I saw in 2020, but he proved me and all of the other doubters wrong by winning 4 stages of the Tour of Turkey and then 4 stages of the Tour de Bloody France. I mean, that's a safe way to shut up critics, isn't it? That said, the harshest of critics will point out that those 4 stage wins at the Tour were in the absence of the world's best sprinters from the last few years. Caleb Ewan, Dylan Groenewegen, Fabio Jakobsen, and the man he replaced at the last minute, Sam Bennett. But that doesn't matter in my book. A win is a win, particularly when 4 of them come at the biggest race in the world. And he's now equalled Eddie Merckx for Tour de France stage wins. Can he surpass him, I guess, is the next question. Well, firstly, he's got to get selected for the race next year. As far as I've seen, there's been no official confirmation that he's been re-signed to the Koenig Quick-Step for next year, but if we assume that's a done deal, we also have to take into account that Patrick Lefevere has pointed to Fabio Jakobsen as his key sprinter for next year's Tour. To me though, none of it really matters. Mark Cavendish has this season underlined his title as the best sprinter of all time, and I know there are thousands of fans out there who would delight to see him back to his best. Sticking with sprinters, we also learned that Lorena Wiebes is head and shoulders above her competitors in that department in the Women's World Tour. The 22-year-old took 12 victories from just 53 days of racing this year, but believe it or not, that hit rate is some distance behind what she achieved in 2019. Back then, she won 15 races in 44 days of racing. With her team, DSM, perfecting their lead out, it's hard to see who's going to knock her off the sprinting throne, particularly given how young she still is. I personally can't see anybody currently capable of doing that, but then that's the beauty of cycling. Incredible talents can emerge very quickly indeed. One thing's for sure though, Wiebes is the sprinter to beat in 2022. And finally, we learnt this year that Mathieu van der Poel is the most exciting rider in the world. Okay, that's a personal opinion there. I just love watching him race. So he's part of a generation of riders who seem to have ripped up the modern rulebook as to how you go about winning big races. Those of us who've been watching bike racing for a long time, I think have become attuned to how you win the biggest races. Save energy, use your team, and only make your move on a key segment towards the end. Van der Poel goes when he wants, which often seems to be when he's bored, rather than when it makes sense to attack, and I absolutely love it. 3 examples from this season. Kuurne-Brussels-Kuurne. He turns up saying he's going to work for his teammate Tim Merlier, then attacked with over 80 k's to go, only getting caught with 2 kilometres remaining. So that one didn't work out, but it did in Tirreno Adriatico on stage 5. In grisly conditions and on a circuit full of short and very steep climbs, he attacks with 53 k's to go and despite blowing his doors off near the end, clings on to victory ahead of Pogačar. Unbelievable. And then the one that I think all of us will remember forevermore, stage 2 of this year's Tour de France. I mean, to have the audacity to attack on the Mur de Bretagne with 1 lap to go, with the sole aim of picking up bonus seconds so that when he attacks and wins the stage the second time up, he'll also have the yellow jersey, is just absolutely bonkers. But normal, I guess, in the world of Van der Poel. Now let's not forget, this is the biggest race in the world where he did that, with the best riders in the world in attendance, and he looks like he's in a different league. Just before I move on, I'll leave you with this on this front. 2 mammoth attacks that he made at Strade Bianche back in March.
Also Tom Pitcock just starts to flow, and here goes Mathieu van der Poel. Lift off for Van der Poel, and Alaphilippe is the man who's trying to follow. The move, now we get the move. It's lift-off number 2 for Van der Poel, and look at that difference. Look at the space open up. Bernal is out. It is Van der Poel who's going away.
Bring on 2022. I can't wait. I bloody love road racing. Thanks incidentally to all of you who commented last week with your favourite moments from this season, and please feel free to get involved again this week and let me know what your hot takes were from 2021. I'd love to read them. Moving on to cyclocross now, and yesterday was the 5th round of the UCI Cycle Cross World Cup in Overijse in Belgium. Held on a course which included cobbles and plenty of mud, it was the youngsters who showed everybody how it was done in the women's race. For a long time, we've been wondering who might put an end to Dutch dominance in women's cyclocross, and finally we have our answer. 20-year-old Hungarian super talent Blanka Vas of SD Works. It had been the World Cup leader Denise Betsma who set the pace from the start, but it was soon clear she wasn't really at ease in the slippery conditions, and in the end it was a crash that allowed Vas, along with 19-year-old Puck Pieterse, to close the gap to the front. From there, Betsma continued to fall back, whilst Vas ultimately proved too strong for Pieterse, edging clear of her with a lap to go and increasing that lead all the way to the line. It marked the first ever World Cup elite win for Vas, who was 4th in the Elite Road Championships just a few weeks ago. We're going to be hearing a lot more of that name in the coming years, that's for sure. For Pieterse, despite not winning, it was also a breakthrough ride at this level. She held on to take 2nd place, whilst Betsma had to settle for 4th. She was caught and out-sprinted by Lucinda Brandt, who'd spent much of the race battling to come back after a tangle of bikes of Van Empel on the opening lap. Also of note was Clara Honsinger's ride. The American champion took a fine 5th place on the day. In the men's race, a crash for Quinten Hermans left him on the back foot, quite literally at a point as he had to change a broken shoe. An elite trio formed at the front of the race with Toon Aerts, Michael van Torenhout and World Cup leader Ellie Iserbyt managing to get clear of the rest, and there was nothing to separate them until the final lap. Aerts looked like he'd do his usual upping of the tempo in the closing stages of the race, but ultimately was unable to match the pace of Iserbyt. The Belgian would go on to take his 3rd win of the 5 World Cups so far, but he did have to work hard for it, pushed all the way by his teammate Van Torenhout. So after those 5 rounds, the overall standings look like this. Iserbyt extends his lead to 45 points over Van Torenhout, with Aerts slipping to 3rd place, just 1 point behind him. And just 1 point behind Aerts is Hermans, who'll be regretting that early mistake yesterday. In the women's, we have a tie at the top of the leaderboard. Brandt and Betsma both on 147 points. Pieterse is now up to 3rd, 35 points adrift, and Vas up to 4th. With 11 rounds still remaining though, there is a lot still to play for. The World Cup takes a short break now, returning in 2 weeks' time with round 6 in Tabor over in the Czech Republic. I'll update you now on what's coming up on GCN Plus this week, and this weekend we're already onto the European Cyclocross Championships. They take place around the Vanberg in the Netherlands, so whilst today is all about the Koppenberg Cross in Belgium, which you'll be able to watch on demand by the time this show is out, this weekend it's all about the Trash Climb, which is also cobbled in places. It was used last week in the Ronde van Drenthe and also the venue for Mathieu van der Poel's last victory at the Dutch National Championships. The women's elite race comes on Saturday and then it's the men's on Sunday. And on Saturday evening, it's the first round of the much anticipated UCI Track Champions League. Last week I promised you a preview, so here it is. Mallorca hosts the first of the 5 rounds of the inaugural series, which will be live on GCN Plus from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. GMT on Saturday. Each evening consists of 2 events for the sprinters, the sprint and the keirin, and 2 for the endurance riders, the scratch and the elimination. The scratch will take place over 20 laps of the velodrome, so just 5 kilometres, with the first across the line taking the win, whilst the elimination takes place over 36 laps, with the last place rider every 2 laps taken out of the race until we have a winner. In the sprint, it will be 3 timed laps of the track in qualification, with the best times going on to the semi-finals and finals, whilst in the keirin, it's the usual format behind the derny. There will be 18 men and 18 women for each race, and some big names are lining up for the series. Harry Lavreysen and Jeffrey Hoagland have dominated the sprint events at the Olympics and World Championships this year, and will be the riders to beat in the sprint events here too, whilst for the equivalent women's events, the Germans will be the ones to beat. 5-time world champion Emma Heinz and 3-time world champion Leah Friedrich will be lining up against the likes of Olympic champions Kelsey Mitchell and Anastasia Volnova of Canada and Russia respectively. In the endurance events, Kirsten Wild and Annette Edmondson will be riding some of their last races as pro riders in the series and will be up against Katie Archibald, amongst others. In the men's, Ed Clancy is the most decorated of those taking part. He will be up against Aaron Gates of New Zealand and Kelland O'Brien of Australia, amongst many others, in the scratch and elimination races. So make sure you don't miss it. It will be fast, action-packed and exhilarating from start to finish. And if you can't catch it live, you'll be able to get it on demand when you wish in every GCN Plus territory. And finally, you'll be able to tune into our live coverage of round 4 of the ZRL Premier Division tonight at 7 p.m. GMT on YouTube and Facebook. Today's event is on the Harrogate course, which is notoriously steep and punchy climbs. Many, in fact, are saying it'll be the hardest of all 6 rounds. So quite frankly, I'm very pleased to be watching rather than competing. In other news, it was reported on Wielerflits last week that Tiesj Benoot is set to break his contract with Team DSM. If true, Benoot will be the latest in a long list of riders who've left the team earlier than expected. Marcel Kittel, Tom Dumoulin, Warren Barguil and Mark Hirschi amongst the other high profile of those. The more it happens, the more you question the general managerial style of the team rather than it being anything to do with the riders themselves. These latest rumours are yet to be confirmed but do come from a normally very reliable source. No rumours though have surfaced as to the possible destination of Benoot, although I wouldn't be surprised to see him rejoin Lotto Soudal. It was announced last week that Great Britain will make a bid to host the Tour de France Grand Départ in 2026. Initial reports suggest that stages could be hosted in England, Scotland and Wales, and that the government will be allocating a significant amount of money to prepare for the bid. The last time the race started on these shores was back in Yorkshire in 2014, which saw some of the biggest crowds in recent memory, most of whom I'm sure would love to see the race return. Now, the man who was in yellow when that race headed to France that year was Vincenzo Nibali, and he stated that he will be riding all 5 monuments next year, including Paris-Roubaix, for the very first time. Those of you who watched that Tour de France in 2014 will remember that Nibali rode very well over the wet cobbles of northern France that year, but it's going to be interesting to see how he goes against the specialist next April. In transfer news, Team Bike Exchange, who seem to have a lot of riders leaving and not many arriving, have announced that the American Kristen Faulkner will join on a contract that keeps her with the team until the end of 2023. Faulkner, a very talented rider who won a stage at the Tour of Norway this year. James Shaw has finally managed to make his way back to the World Tour. He turned pro at the age of 20, but after 2 years with the Lotto Soudal team, found himself without a contract. Since then, he's been carving out some very impressive results in lower level teams, and I would say he thoroughly deserves this opportunity that he's now been given by EF Education Nippo for the next 2 years. Lukas Wisniewski is also headed to the American squad and the latest to jump ship from Quebec and Nextash. As to whether that team is a sinking ship, it looks increasingly likely, unfortunately, with no further news from the management about a new title sponsor. And finally, one that I missed last week, Victor Campenaerts will be reunited with his old team Lotto Soudal for the next 2 years, and that same team have extended the contract of Steph Kras and Matt Holmes for another year. That's all for now. I'll be back next week to round up all the news from the world of bike racing, so I hope to see you then. Goodbye.